Okay, we are in business. Some technical difficulties. Got those hammered out. I am mic'd up once again. I got my Diet 7 Up here. I got my notes somewhere. Where are those? There we go. Got my notes. This thing's clanking. That's no good. Get that over here. There we go. Okay. Here we go. Period 4. Notes. Number 1, you should have the slides actually in front of you. So you have those. So you don't have to sit there. They're kind of tiny. I apologize for that. Man, I hope your eyes are good. Those are really tiny. But either way, you don't have to jot that stuff down because you have them in front of you, and we'll work through, talk about some of the stuff on those slides, and you can jot some of that stuff down and go from there. I'm going to try to keep it as jumbled free as possible, but I got notes going everywhere here, so I'm going to do my best. Here we go. Period 4. All right. Yeah. Let's just get to this. Come on. There we go. Settle in. Okay, so when we start talking about Jefferson and his party, the Democratic Republicans, their view of the Constitution a little bit different than that of, say, George Washington, Adams, Hamilton. They took a little more liberty as, being able to interpret what the Constitution said, kind of those implied powers that the government had. It's not explicitly written, but, we can just assume that we can do it. Jefferson was different than that. He was more of a constructionist. That's what it says on the screen here, but kind of a literal, this is what it says, so that's what we can do. If it doesn't say it, probably shouldn't be doing it. There's a funny little cartoon there. This debate still rages today, right? There's, those when they look at different things in the Constitution, are you interpreting the Constitution? What do they mean? Or are you being literal, like a Jeffersonian Republican, and saying that's what it says, therefore, that's what we get. This is kind of mocking the Second Amendment a little bit. And that's usually a big one, right? Second Amendment. How do we interpret that? What does it mean? Okay, let's move on, though. Away from that. Okay, so Jefferson becomes president, right? He is the first president that's not a Federalist. So we talked about the takeover in that last notes from Adams to Jefferson, how power shifted, looked like the Constitution was going to work. The American form of government was going to survive. So Jefferson, he does a couple things. He does continue neutrality, right? George Washington had warned against getting tangled up in some of those European affairs, said, bad idea, don't do it. So Jefferson's going to follow that policy, but it's not going to stay that way, as we'll find out as we make our way through the notes here. He did encourage the sale of Western lands. We're going to talk about some purchases and what happened in the West very soon. And you can see some of the things he reduced under his presidency. Remember, he's not a fan of big government. He's a small government kind of guy, so it would make sense that he was reducing some of the power of the federal government, getting rid of some excise tax, including the tax on whiskey, right? He was the hero of the Whiskey Rebellion. So he gets rid of that, knocks down the national debt, gets rid of some government jobs. He also, the bureaucracy piece, Washington appointed Jefferson to his cabinet, but he appointed those that didn't necessarily align themselves the same politically, to kind of have a mix of people in his cabinet. Jefferson says no to that. I'm just going to appoint Republicans. I want people that see things the same way I do. Get rid of any of that, room for controversy, if you will. He did maintain the National Bank set up by Hamilton, and that whole debt repayment plan also set up by Hamilton. Let's drive on. Ooh, crashing. It's a nice little map. Nice little map there. So what we got to say. Throw this in. Here we go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. A little bit more. There we go. There it is. Perfect. Okay. So in the West, or, for the America at the time, for the United States at the time, the West was, the Mississippi. And that Mississippi flows south all the way to New Orleans. And for a while, in the late 1700s, right, we had gained access to using that port tax-free, helping the farmers. However, Spain took back New Orleans and some of that territory from France, and they closed that port. That was an issue, right? So now we're not having free access to New Orleans. No good. No good. There's some stuff going on here with the Native Americans and American Indians. We'll talk about this a little bit later on, some slides down the road here. Okay, but if you were curious, that treaty, the Pinckney Treaty of 1795, was the one that opened the port in New Orleans to the American farmers. Okay, so here we go. Gotta take a little sip. I'm struggling here. I'm in my basement, and the lighting is atrocious. I can't hardly see anything. Oh, and then my penmanship is horrible. This is just not working out well. All right, anywho. So all this is going on, and eventually the French, there's some fighting and things going on in Europe, and they're going to take the Louisiana Territory back from Spain. Okay, but as France gets tangled up in these Napoleonic wars, Napoleon's now in charge in France. Many of you probably took world history. AP or just world history, and you know of Napoleon. So he's got all these battles going on. So he had once envisioned this, Louisiana Territory to set up like a French, colony, if you will, and have a big presence in the Americas. But that goes to the wayside because they're fighting in Europe. And he's like, yeah, I don't have time for that anymore. So Jefferson sends some dudes over to Paris to negotiate. And really all they wanted was New Orleans and then part of Florida. They wanted to kind of work themselves east. But when they get there, right, they're like, no, we'll just sell you everything. The whole Louisiana Territory for $15 million. Now, they were approved to spend up to 10. Okay, but they're like, holy cow, this is a smoking deal. Let's do it. Let's do it. So they do. So they do, right? Jefferson is like, yeah, we're going to do that. There's a constitutional issue there. Because nowhere in the Constitution does it say, yes, you can buy land. It's just not in there. So the angle he takes, when he goes to Congress to get approval, is he said it was part of the president's power to make treaties. That's why he was able to secure the funds to buy this land, right? He wants that port in New Orleans. His vision for America is like this agrarian society of like farmers and building the American economy on that rather than like industrial economy of Hamilton and like big cities and that type of thing. And so now they buy this huge tract of land. It's like massive, right? And they don't really know what's out there. So that's where Lewis and Clark come in to check out. One, they're seeking a path to the Pacific. And two, they're trying to figure out, what's out there. What do we got here? And they also want to scout, like, what is the Indian presence and those types of things as well. Okay. Oh, there's my favorite. And there it goes. Okay, yeah. And there we go. Okay. There's the slide. Okay, so the Marshall Court. So by the time of Jefferson's presidency, Federalists had lost power, obviously, in the White House. They've also lost control and the majority in Congress. The only place it still remains is in the Supreme Court. Okay, so that's where the Federalists have their power. Jefferson does not like that. He's like, I don't want Federalists to have power in the Supreme Court. I want them to be like me. Same kind of views. So here's what happens in the important landmark case of Marbury versus Madison. Okay. So Jefferson instructs Madison to not deliver a commission to Marbury, right? He was appointed under Adams as kind of like a last minute appointment to the Supreme Court, but he wasn't actually in the Supreme Court yet. So he's never delivered his commission. Okay. So there's also a dude, and this is Mr. Marshall, on the Supreme Court. Okay. He's on the Supreme Court, and he's actually related to Thomas Jefferson. And he's kind of a thorn in his side in ways because he's a Federalist, one. But here's what happens out of this ruling, okay, is Marshall, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, says, hey, Marbury should have received his commission. Okay, and they go back to some laws from the late 1700s. But he then says the courts were actually given more power than the Constitution allows. So this ruling is based on something that is unconstitutional. So he does not actually give the commission to the Federalist Marbury. Okay, so it's a small loss, for Marshall, who would be a Federalist, right, for the Federalists, because, well, he's not appointed to the Supreme Court. But it establishes judicial review, and it sets up the Supreme Court and gives them their power where they're now allowed to check the other two branches. Okay, try to check those branches, and they can now determine things unconstitutional. After this happens, Jefferson then goes the impeachment route, right? He tries to impeach. He has little success there, right? He does undo the Alien and Sedition Acts and some things like that, but driving on. Okay. Oh, this is some good stuff. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So, election of 1804, Jefferson wins again. There is a bit of a Federalist conspiracy, okay, and then Burr versus Hamilton as they run for governor of New York. So Aaron Burr is determined that he's going to run for governor. He's going to become governor of New York, and he's then going to unite New York with other New England states and then try to secede from the nation to break away. That doesn't work. Okay, that doesn't work because he doesn't win, is why it doesn't work. And with that, it kind of goes away. They were upset with some of the, Democratic Republican values and things that had been going on. Louisiana Purchase, those types of things. Out of this, though, probably more well known, is the duel. So he's upset over some remarks that Hamilton had made about him, and they agree to a duel, and Burr shoots and kills Hamilton. And it's a big blow to the Federalists because Hamilton is kind of like their last big leader, if you will, and with him kind of dies any hope for the Federalists to, resurge or find a leader or move forward. Okay. But Burr, he decides then that he's going to try to take Mexico from Spain, unite with Louisiana, and appoint himself the ruler. So once again, establish a new territory. He's then tried for treason, but he is acquitted on those charges kind of technicalities by the definition of treason, and then just the lack of people and witnesses to the things that actually occurred. So there you go. But ultimately out of there, Burr shoots and kills Alexander Hamilton. Okay. So some things going on elsewhere. Barbary pirates. So, trade, right? The United States is relying heavily on this, that we can trade with whomever we want to. So the Barbary pirates, we're talking about countries kind of on the northern coast of Africa. Okay, and under Washington and under Adams, some of these countries were requiring us to pay tribute, right? Pay money to these countries, and they raised that price, the amount that they wanted, and essentially Jefferson said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to pay." So it does end in some fighting. There's not really a decisive victory, right? But enough to gain respect, kind of from some European powers, right? And to provide safety for U.S. ships. Okay. Which takes us down there to the challenges of, or to, neutrality. Okay, so there's an incident, Leopold. It's a British ship off the Chesapeake. It's just a few miles out, right? It's right on the coast of the United States. And it fires, and three people are killed and 4 are impressed. What that means is the British are literally taking these American sailors and being like, nope, you're a British subject, so you're now part of the British Navy, and they're forcing them, to work and sail with them. Okay, so from this, a lot of people wanted Jefferson to use, to like retaliate, to do something, but what he chooses to do instead is to use diplomacy and economic pressure, which leads to the embargo of 1807. Okay, and what he was hoping for is he was trying to force Britain, back into trading with the United States. So what he did is he embargoed. He said, "Hey, we're not going to trade with Great Britain anymore. They were our number one trading partner, right? Like they need our stuff, but we're not going to do it." And eventually, they'll come crawling back and they'll start trading with us. But it backfires a little bit because the British just start trading with others in Africa and throughout Europe and other places. And it really, really hurt the economy in the United States at the time. Jefferson will repeal this before his presidency ends in 1809. Opening up this trade embargo. But by the way, this just wasn't on Great Britain. It was just essentially everywhere, that we weren't going to trade in hopes that Britain would come around. They didn't. It hurt us, not Britain so much. So he repeals it in 1809, but still keeps on there the British and the French saying, hey, we're not going to trade with those guys. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second under James Madison. Oh, let me back up here, actually. How do I? Previous. Backwards airplane. All right. So James Madison, essentially handpicked by Jefferson to take over. He wins the election. He's viewed as a brilliant thinker, one of these dudes that helped write the Constitution. However, unlike Jefferson, he's a weak public speaker, and he doesn't have the political set that Jefferson has. Okay, here we go. There we go. Madison administration. There you go. There's the electoral map. Hey, Michigan's a territory. That's fun. Oh, yeah. That is fun. Come on. Get down here. There we go. There we go. That's what I'm talking about. Okay. So a couple things going on here. So we already talked about, Madison wins. There's that Charles Pinckney again. He's the one that had that treaty that opened up New Orleans. He runs as a Federalist. He loses, right? The Federalists at this time, really their power is very sectional. It's just in the Northeast, those New England states, as you can kind of see on the map there. Very good. Where am I going? Okay, so the embargo, talking about the embargo that was placed by Jefferson, right? It does lead to some seats flipping in Congress back to some Federalist candidates. Okay, but let's jump down here to Macon's Bill number 2. Yeah, let's go there. That Non-Intercourse Act, that just sounds weird. Man. All right, anywho. All right, so Nathaniel Macon, he proposed a bill, right, to do away with that Non-Intercourse Act, right? That's the repealing of that trade act, saying, hey, we still can't trade with Britain and France. So Nathaniel Macon is saying, no, we just need to resume trade with everybody, right? We need to open it up. So he says in his bill, like, we're going to resume trade, but here's the deal. We'll do it either with Britain or with France. And whichever one, whoever wants to take this offer first will then agree to not trade with the other, right? France and Britain, they're enemies. So, we're trying to play them off of each other. So Napoleon jumps on this, like, yeah, that would be awesome. We'll trade with you. So it's like, oh, cool. So the U.S. then cuts off trade with Britain, continues to not trade with Britain until 1811. The problem with this is Napoleon really didn't uphold his end of the bargain because, they're caught in this fight, the Napoleonic Wars with Great Britain and Europe. So they're raiding U.S. ships and taking the goods, and they continue to do that even after he says, yeah, we're going to trade with you guys. So really, he tricked us, and that's not very cool. That's not very cool. Just continues to seize those American ships. Man, I feel like I'm really rambling tonight. Really rambling. All right. So British-American tensions. So here's some things going on. Right. So one, we decide not to trade with them. We take Napoleon's word, so they're not super thrilled about that. Two, we viewed the British as worse than the French. Yes, the French were seizing our ships and taking our stuff, but the British were actually, impressing people, like taking people, American sailors, and then making them, sail for the British. They're taking them captive and being like, you're now on our side. Okay, so that was going on. Some of the tension, America's desire for Florida, which was a Spanish colony. Spain and Britain were allies. British trade policy, blockading European trade with America. And then Western expansion. Okay, Western expansion. Remember, after the Revolutionary War, the British still had a presence on the Western frontier. They didn't disappear, right? They were still there. They were out west. Okay, they were still around. Okay, boom, 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 boom. What else do we need to mention here? It is good to note that in the you can see the Battle of Tippecanoe there in 1811. Tecumseh had tried to form an Indian confederacy of all the tribes that were east of the Mississippi, the Shawnee and all of that, and it was put down, and eventually Tecumseh is going to be killed, and with that, it's going to put an end to any confederacy or unifying of American Indians east of the Mississippi. Okay, but from that rebellion, right, that whole idea, many in the United States felt that it was the British that were kind of behind it, inciting the Indians to go and try to attack the American settlements. Okay, and then you had the Warhawks. And this is a term we'll hear again several times, but a Warhawk is typically somebody who's like, yeah, let's go to war, right? The hawks. It's kind of a predatory bird, right? Eat mice and stuff. Good eyesight. I've got one by my house, actually. He's always hovering around, looking for a rabbit. Something like that. Either way, though, right? These war hawks are able to convince Madison, combined with all this other stuff on here, right, going on, that we should go to war with Great Britain. And this is the War of 1812. Okay, let's just get through it. He's been talking a lot. Perfect. Okay. So here we go. We've got a lot of stuff written here. I got to make sense of. I got stuff left and right, up and down. Goodness gracious. Yeah, that's later. Okay. So here we go. So the election of 1812, right? James Madison, he wins again. Okay. So we have support for the war coming out of the South, Western states, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. Those opposed to the war, no surprise, really, right? Those places that are predominantly Federalists, the New England states, right? Those are the ones, because they're trying to, make a profit between the wars going on between Britain and France, and they're sending goods and those types of things, right? Those Federalists and the old Democratic Republicans, saw it as a scheme to get more support, to try to conquer Florida and Canada, right? And then there's this whole clash between, federal power, maintain peace, like what's the role of the government and all of that. But the war itself, right, it's declared, so here we go. The invasion of Canada. It was a 3-part invasion, so that's fun. It wasn't really successful, so that part's not too great. So they were easily repulsed, right, and sent packing. But they did manage to build some government buildings in York, which is modern-day Toronto. But really all this invasion did was just encourage retaliation by the British. So, yeah, it didn't really do much. Somebody once said, let a sleeping dog lie. You know what I mean? Don't wake him up. Okay, and then there's the Navy. Okay, there was a guy, Oliver Hazard Perry, pretty sweet name. And this is actually where Tecumseh, we saw him in the few slides earlier, is killed. Our Navy actually does a pretty decent job of holding back. We've got good ships and those types of things. William Henry Harrison. We forced the British to retreat and those types of things. Chesapeake Campaign. A lot of this is taking place, and there's actually some Michigan ties, right? The fort on Mackinac, Michilimackinac. And there's, throughout Michigan, there's some context here. All right, Chesapeake Campaign. So the British eventually defeat Napoleon, right? And it allows them to send more forces, more resources to North America. And this is where they burn down the White House. Okay, they burn down the White House. They march through Washington and they burn it down. Okay, they then head towards Baltimore and they shell it. But Fort McHenry survives. And this is where we get the Star-Spangled Banner, right? This is where it comes from. Francis Scott Key, right? He's the one that penned it. And he looked up and saw the shelling and all that stuff going on. And that's where we get it, right there. And then ironically, the Southern Campaign, right? You got Andrew Jackson down there, and he's winning some victories. He defeats the Creek Nation, which was a British ally, the Creeks, Native Americans. He defeats them and then heads south into New Orleans, and he fights the battle. The problem with this, he wins. It's a decisive victory, but he fights it 2 weeks after the war had actually ended. So, geez, I guess if word could have spread a little faster. Didn't need it. The war was over. But either way, right, he wins the Battle of New Orleans. Okay, so from this, couple things. Okay, Couple things. So there were some states, mostly in the New England area, that were not happy with what was going on, and they were talking about secession breaking away. But what they did is they met in Hartford and they came up with this whole idea of, let's try to change the Constitution to a 2/3 vote on future declarations of war, make it trickier to go to war, those types of things. But then the war ends. The war ends, and it's at this point, that a lot of people kind of turn on the Federalists like you're unpatriotic, right? You're not true Americans. Where's your spirit, right? And it's not okay. And it ultimately is kind of the death of the Federalists with their talk of secession. And then we end up ending the war. We don't necessarily win the war, but it's over. Okay. And the treaty itself that ends it is the Treaty of Ghent in Belgium. So we go over to Belgium. And nothing really, like I just said, was gained or lost, right? We didn't take anything. We didn't get Canada or Florida or really anything. The war just ended. It was like, yep, I guess we're done. And the war ended. But one thing that did continue was the expansion westward, right? As Indian defenses weakened without that British support, they were kind of doomed, and their time was limited, knowing that expansion would continue westward. So legacy of the war, here's just some things, after the war. So U.S. gains respect of other nations, right? We're willing to fight, not afraid, to mix it up a little bit. U.S. accepts Canada as part of the British Empire. So, a tense relationship with Canada throughout the 1800s, early 1900s. Not like it is today, right? Very tense. All right. So it led to the decline and death of the Federalist Party. Continued decline and decimation of American Indians. Blockade served as a catalyst for industrial self-sufficiency. So when we implemented that blockade, right, we had to rely on ourselves for everything, right? So that economy, the cities, the growth, to do that. It brought on a war hero with Andrew Jackson and Harrison. We'll hear those names in the near future. Okay, and growth of nationalism and Western expansion, that whole era of good feelings. I'm feeling pretty good because we're done. That was long. Man, I was rambling. My 7-Up's almost gone. Still can't really see. This is great. Okay. See ya.